All right, wonderful. Well, as it is 7 p.m., we're gonna go ahead and get started. I think we're waiting on Brigham. Hopefully he'll pop up soon. But welcome to everybody here. We're so happy to have this turnout and so happy to have you all here on this wonderful panel. And thank you also to our panelists who are willing to spend this time discussing with us. So as we go ahead and get started, I mentioned this earlier, but for those who have just hopped on, this on the screen is a link to, or a QR code to the poll EV, where you can look at the questions that people already put in there, or you can upvote questions that you really feel like you want discussed first, or you can downvote them if you don't like them, or you can add new questions that are not present that you want to see talked about today on the panel. This is a panel talking about the Wilson's Phalarope and the petition to add it to the Endangered Species Act. And we're so excited to hear from our wonderful guests today. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce them. We have 4 wonderful panelists, and I'm going to start with Beth Parker. Beth Parker is a senior attorney at the University of Utah College of Law, and she is the law and policy lead for the Great Salt Lake Project. She's experienced in environmental law, air pollution law, water law, and climate change initiatives. And then we have Brigham Daniels. Brigham is a professor of law at the University of Utah. He is the director of the Great Salt Lake Project and an expert in environmental and property law. And then Patrick Donnelly. Patrick is a conservation biologist from the Center of Biological Diversity. He is the Great Basin Director and focused on fighting for biodiversity, public lands, and endangered species. Then Tim Davis. Tim is the Deputy Great Salt Lake Commissioner and the former director of the Division of Water Quality. He's a national leader on water and land permitting policy and management. So special welcome and thank you to our wonderful panelists here. So as we get started, I want to go ahead and start off with this question, and maybe it's a little bit more directed to Patrick, but I would love to hear, for those of us who don't know, a little context on the Wilson's Phalarope, what it is. Tell us a little about the bird itself.
Sure, yeah, and thank you all for having me tonight. So Wilson's Phalarope is an inland shore bird. It's very unique because it is a shore bird like the ones you might see flying up and down the oceanic coasts of the continent, except it lives entirely inland. It is migratory, so it goes from its breeding areas on the northern Great Plains and in the central part of North America, and then it spends our winters down in South America on the Altiplano, and then further south at a place called Mar Chiquita. This long distance migration is a pretty remarkable facet of this bird's ecology. It flies almost 4,000 miles nonstop. As far as we know, they don't stop on that 4,000-mile journey. And the reason they can do that is because just beforehand, they will spend several weeks to months at the major saline lakes in the Great Basin, fattening up on brine flies and brine shrimp. And so these, the Great Salt Lake and also Lake Abert in Oregon and Mono Lake in California are these large saline lakes, and the abundant life form in these saline lakes are invertebrates, brine shrimp and brine flies in particular. And I don't know if you all have probably been out to the Great Salt Lake in the middle of summer. It's an almost unlimited supply of flies and shrimp that are there. And so that's why these birds congregate there, is to take advantage of that unlimited, basically, food source. They put on a tremendous amount of weight. They also do a complete molt, where they completely shed their feathers and grow a new set of flight feathers in preparation for the 4,000-mile journey to South America. And so while Wilson's Phalarope is spread all across the country at various times in its life cycle, it's been documented in all 50 states. There's actually this tremendous bottleneck in the late summer when almost all the birds stop at either Great Salt Lake, Lake Abert in Oregon, or Mono Lake. And that's a very unique facet of its biology, and one that makes it particularly susceptible to habitat destruction in those 3 saline lakes. And so that is why we're here tonight talking about Wilson's Phalarope and Great Salt Lake.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Patrick. Brigham, I think, is now on the call. You hear Brigham?
I am here. I'm just trying to get. I am here. I'm just trying to get online off my phone.
Perfect. No worries.
Sorry.
Take your time.
My computer crashed, and I'm just trying to get back on. But
Oh,
I missed the question, Kate.
Oh, that's okay. We had just Patrick just introduced the Wilson's Phalarope to us. So go ahead and take your time. No worries, Brigham. We're happy to have you here tonight.
Yeah, give me 2 minutes and I'll be on my computer and off my phone.
Perfect. Wonderful.
Thanks.
So I guess we'll jump right in then and talking about this petition. So I would love to hear from our panelists, from many of you, on what is an Endangered Species Act petition, and how often is it successful, and what does that mean for the Wilson's Phalarope? And again, that might be a question for Patrick, so I apologize. But
yeah, I can take this question.
Sure, go for it, Brigham.
Great. So the Endangered Species Act, there are two pathways for a species to get listed. And one is that the Fish and Wildlife Service takes on that responsibility and just determines based on its own read of the best available science that that's what should happen. The second pathway is that a citizen petition can be created and then lodged with the agency. The nonprofit organization that Patrick is a part of is probably the largest, I think it is certainly the largest repository of petitions that are have been created. What ends up happening once a petition is filed is that the Fish and Wildlife Service has strict timelines that it has to make different determinations. The first one is to determine whether the listing may be warranted as 90 days. And then the question then is it in fact warranted? And it has a year. The Fish and Wildlife Service has a lot of things in the queue. And one of the ways that the agency generally deals with these things is by not dealing with them. It is almost, if this plays to type, which I can't imagine that it won't, the Fish and Wildlife Service will likely not be able to meet the deadline. It may be then that what would typically happen is that the entity that brought the petition would then sue the Fish and Wildlife Service, and then they would come to some sort of cooperative agreement about what is a more doable timeline for the service. And this could take a number of years beyond the allocated time. So, I don't know what the legal strategy here is for the petitioners, but that is frequently what ends up happening in a case like this one. And that's sort of the nuts and bolts of it. I could say more about the analysis if you want, but that's the general process that we'll follow, both the formal one and probably what I would expect.
Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that, Brigham. I'm sure we'll have some further questions down the line. In response to that brief overview of the Endangered Species Act and the petition, why, I guess, in your expertise, all of the panelists, why do you feel like this petition is being brought to lawmakers right now?
Well, as the lead petitioner, I'll just pop in on this.
Yes,
the origin of the petition really came during Great Salt Lake's crash in 22.
Mm-hmm.
We were seeing it collapse before our very eyes. I think everyone on this call was extremely alarmed during the fall of 22 as to what was happening with Great Salt Lake. And, we were looking for a way that we could be of assistance. And we were hearing from colleagues in Utah, but also scientists that, hey, this is of great concern. And so that's really where the genesis of the idea for the petition came from. was sort of looking at the trajectory of Great Salt Lake and thinking about all the organisms that depend on it. The few, including Wilson's phalarope, that are sort of uniquely vulnerable should Great Salt Lake actually collapse. And so, you know, it very much was born of the crisis that we're experiencing. I would say, you know, it takes a long time to write a very long scientific petition like this. And so it just so happened that a year and a half later, the lake is not in as bad shape as it was in fall of 22. You know, the overall trajectory, as we understand it, is still unchanged, despite a couple good winters. And so, so that's why we chose this moment in time to do the petition.
Okay, I love that. Thank you for your response. A question that has been upvoted here on the poll EV says, how would a successful listing help the Wilson's phalarope and Great Salt Lake? And how much of a difference will this listing make?
I'll take that. I think that's a really complicated question.
Mm.
You know, I think there's also an assumption in the question, and I'm not trying to rebuff the assumption either. I think to me, it's an open question, and that is that it will be generally a benefit if the phalarope is listed. To me, I think that the best pathway forward, and this kind of gets back to, you know, what is likely to happen. I mean, and I'm sure that Tim cannot speak for the state on this. I don't think the state has made a decision about what its strategy would be, but he definitely can maybe talk about the options. I'm not sure how he feels about that, but to me, I would think that what this state particularly, the state is not part of the petition process formally, but when a petition like this is lodged, what ends up happening is there is consultation with the relevant kind of state and local government, depending on what the scale of the species is that we're talking about here. In this case, it would be a state or maybe multiple states, but at least I'd imagine there'd be some serious conversations about the phalarope with the state. And the main reason for that is the one that Patrick gave, is that the basic theory, it's not the entire theory behind the petition, but the basic theory behind the petition is an endangered Great Salt Lake has led to an endangered species. And because the Great Salt Lake is largely under the jurisdiction of the state of Utah, although some of the headwaters do flow through other states, but largely is in the control of the state of Utah. I think the state of Utah very well may be an active participant in the decision about whether it's to be listed. And the way that the decision is going to be made is the Fish and Wildlife Service will not only look at the facts on the ground, but they'll look at the measures that have been taken to save the phalarope. And I think that, to me, what the petition could, one outcome of this that isn't a listing is basically there's a category called a candidate species. A candidate species means basically, I mean, this isn't the formal definition, but the basic way you could think about it is this is one that we need to watch really closely. And sometimes a candidate species is you go to that because it's going to take a little bit more time, and it's just going to take, you know, a short period before it's listed. But longer term candidate species are those species that you've got an agreement with something like an entity like a state that says the state is going to do X, Y, and Z in order to help save the phalarope. And, you know, that might result in, you know, part of this may be laid out already in the commissioner's plan, but I mean, there's certainly a lot more that could be done, not only at the state level, but federal level and local level, and all, you know, private sector, public sector, all of this in between. I think that the state, one strategy the state might take is to try to get as much firm commitments as it can to try to figure out how to get more water to the lake and see if it can stave off the listing. I mean, I'm not the state's lawyer, and they've got people that are very capable and may have different opinions than I do, but my general opinion is that would probably be my best bet. If I was going to say what I would think would be the best course of action for the state, that would be the pathway I would recommend.
And Kate, if I can just piggyback off of what
Please, yes.
Briggs said about the state working with stakeholders to work together, so the Wilson's Phalarope will be designated as a candidate species, that sort of lower priority listing. The state will need to take meaningful steps, even if the state doesn't agree with this, with the petition. The state sort of now has a chance to collaborate and take meaningful steps and efforts to conserve the Wilson's Phalarope. And these efforts will help protect the overall ecosystem of Great Salt Lake. So going back to the question, how will helping the Phalarope help Great Salt Lake? Well, as Briggs said, an endangered lake, an endangered lake leads to endangered species. And so we wrote a report last week and kind of just said, so goes the lake, so goes the species that are reliant on the lake. And so if the state works to avoid a listing through active efforts to get more water to the lake, it will protect the overall ecosystem of Great Salt Lake with positive impacts for Wilson's Phalarope, but also other species that rely on the lake as well. And all of us humans who are, in the Great Salt Lake Basin and beyond.
Thank you for your responses. A question that is also on our list that comes to mind as you're speaking to that. I wonder if anybody else has thoughts on how, when coordinating with different stakeholders, how will this petition affect the willingness of people to come to the table?
I would love to hear from Tim on this. I mean, I don't know if you feel comfortable talking about it. I think it's a complicated question, but I'd love to hear from you.
It is complicated, and the reality is, and this was one of the main takeaways and lessons as we were developing the Great Salt Lake strategic plan, was it's going to take everyone in the basin in order to get the lake to a healthy level and be able to sustain it there. And with or without the petition, the state was already committed to getting the lake to a healthy level. In fact, we established for the first time an official healthy range for the lake, as well as a floor, to make sure that we don't go back to 2022. And whether I'm not sure how different groups are going and individuals are going to respond to the petition. I haven't had a lot of conversations with them about it, but I do think it's critical, again, with or without the petition, that we're able to get all of the parties who use water, who manage water around the lake, who manage species, to work together to make sure that we get enough water to the lake. We're able to sustain it at a healthy rain level over time. So my biggest fear going forward is that we spend more time focusing on that we get polarized rather than come together and working collaboratively to try to get enough water to the lake and to get it to that healthy range and sustain it.
If I could just provide some context on sort of the Endangered Species Act part of this. We've been talking a lot about what could be the effects of this petition and the sort of political implications of it. But, ultimately, the Endangered Species Act is meant to protect endangered species. Wilson's Phalarope had already fallen, its population has already fallen 50 to 70% over just 40 or 50 years ago. It may already qualify as an endangered species just based on that, those dramatic population losses. But ultimately, you know, the Endangered Species Act is the most successful conservation law in the world at preventing extinction. 99% of listed species are still with us today. And so, you know, I think there are always political overtones to the Endangered Species Act. And I think certainly it's kind of pervasive in the Intermountain West that listings are sort of considered bad. But actually listing a species under the Endangered Species Act is its best hope for avoiding extinction. And however, you know, what does the Endangered Species Act do? It provides a backstop, basically, to make sure these species don't go extinct. But that can also happen through the conservation agreement process. You know, as Brigham was describing, this candidate status gives time to come up with conservation agreements. There's a process called the Candidate Conservation Agreement with Assurances, the CCAA, which is basically a document in which stakeholders make binding commitments for actions they will take to prevent the extinction of a species and thus obviate the need for listing. And so certainly, you know, a CCAA might be appropriate with Wilson's Phalarope, but it's that assurances word that's the important part. And I think, you know, the assurances with Wilson's Phalarope would be how much water is going to make it to the lake. But just worth noting that, you know, the Endangered Species Act, while it can get a bad rap, is actually tremendously successful at accomplishing its goals of like preventing wildlife from going extinct, which I think pretty much everyone agrees is what we want to avoid. So, yeah.
And Kate, if I can elaborate on that a little bit, there are a few federal laws that can potentially be used to put pressure on the state of Utah. Endangered Species Act, as Patrick said, and it is very successful. The Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. But under the Endangered Species Act, I think you asked about, you know, the state's willingness to come together. I think we can look at past precedent in the state with the Utah greater sage grouse ESA petition that in 2011, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service listed the greater sage grouse as warranted but not precluded. So that's this category that we're talking about. And Utah came together and worked really hard. And in 2013, the then Governor Herbert authorized let me just read this so I get it right, conservation plan for greater sage grouse in Utah. And we also had an approved resource management plan. And this was a really detailed plan. Utah worked really hard on this. And a result of this plan and conservation efforts, including similar efforts across other states in the West, because the sage grouse was implicated for potential listing in other states as well. But in 2015, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service listed the sage grouse as not warranted for listing under the Endangered Species Act. So that's a real success story, and one in which Utah was a player and came to the table. And I think that's something we can really look at as we're looking at this listing.
Can I say a couple of things? And I definitely don't. I hope that this doesn't come off the wrong way, because I really am someone who cares deeply about the lake. I spend a lot of my day thinking about the lake every day, and trying to figure out how to save it. But here is I realize that I mean, Patrick was trying to put the gloss on, you know, sort of the success rate or the successfulness of the ESA, and I'm not trying to dispute that either, but I would say, you know, one of the reactions that I have heard, even with people who are very sympathetic to the lake. I was at a dinner a week or two ago, and I mean, this was about how to save the lake, and one of the participants in the dinner said, "Who cares about a bird, right? My home, my health, the dust from the lake, the viability of the livability of this region is what things that's at stake. And I recognize that, not every interest that we have in the environment has a hook as useful as the Endangered Species Act. And part of what is happening in the listing process, in my view, or this whole, this is as much about us saving the lake as it is saving the species. But one of the problems, and I mean, I think the politics of this really matter a lot. I think one of the problems that we may be inviting is either people kind of losing focus about all of the reasons that we might need to save the lake, right? I recognize that the petitioners and the other people at the rally, that when this was unveiled, I think that they tried to paint that broad picture about why the lake is important. But, this is so much, the stakes with the lake are so much greater than even one species, and even multiple species. There's just so many dimensions to the problem, including human health and the viability of our community. The other thing that is kind of fragile here in the politics is, I'm not saying that this will happen, but it was something that is worrying to me, that, it's possible that kind of action for the lake is, harder in some ways. I mean, in some ways it's easier because it's like, okay, now we have this political pressure, but, I worry that it's going to make policymakers, or at least some policymakers, recalcitrant, that they're going to be angry about the petition, and that anger, might be felt in foot dragging on issues to do with the lake. And I think that one of the big challenges that the commissioner's office particularly faces is trying to inspire action of policymakers that, despite the fact that they might be angry and not happy about what happened, that, to kind of move things in the right direction. So, I think that a lot of these legal tools are meaningful and real, and there are real potential upsides to them, but there are also downsides in using them. And it's frequently hard to put your finger on, like, what is the smartest way forward. I mean, I think that, to me, that's a complicated question, and a lot of it depends on where you think hope for the ultimate action to save the lake comes from. But yeah, at any rate, I just kind of want to put this out there. I'm not trying to resolve this. I don't even know how I think about it or feel about it, but I think it is something that's worth thinking about.
Thank you for all those responses. I know that one of the main concerns for the listing of the Wilson's Phalarope is federal input. And so along with that, what federal intervention is expected if the Phalarope gets listed?
Well, one of the main tools of the Endangered Species Act is Section 7, which is consultation. So any action that the federal government undertakes, whether that's approving something, permitting something, or funding something, they have to consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service to determine whether that activity will jeopardize the continued existence of a listed species. So if Wilson's Phalarope was added to the endangered species list, the federal government would have to consult on all of their actions. And how could that affect Great Salt Lake? Well, for instance, the Bureau of Reclamation has dams on the Bear River. So their operations would need to be scrutinized to see if they are contributing to any harm to Wilson's Phalarope and the lake. I am actually not totally familiar with federal funding for various water projects around the Great Salt Lake Basin, but any of them would require consultation should Wilson's Phalarope listed. So Section 7 is sort of the main, I call it where the rubber meets the road with the Endangered Species Act, because ultimately that is our government saying we're going to look at everything we do to decide whether it will harm an endangered species. However, that is only really a binding commitment on the federal government. The other place where the rubber meets the road with the ESA is Section 9 of the ESA, which is the take prohibition. So take is defined as harming an endangered species, which can include destroying its habitat. The take prohibition is binding on everybody. Nobody's allowed to go out and harm an endangered species once it's listed. How the take prohibition affects state regulatory agencies is still very much an area of active development in the law. We recently won a case at the Nevada State Supreme Court in which the state engineer, the water regulator in Nevada, said that we are bound not to allocate water if it harms an endangered fish, the Moapa dace. And that was upheld by the state Supreme Court. And so now in Nevada, the state engineer has said that one of the criteria under which they will allocate water is, will this harm a listed species? Not so much because they're saying the ESA, we have to implement the ESA. They're more saying, we need to avoid liability under the Endangered Species Act. That the state of Nevada has said that. As far as I know, that has not been dealt with in Utah law or Utah courts yet. And so it's impossible to speculate about how that could play out, especially because, a listing would be a decade from now, most likely. But those are the two real substantive measures of the ESA that provide direct protections for listed species.
Thank you. Another question here along with that asks, will the state or federal government take people's water rights if the listing is successful?
It's hard to know exactly how this plays out. But what I will say is, there's a lot of different, a lot of it depends on, for water specifically, the water that is most vulnerable to disruption would be those water rights that are basically secured not just through water law, but secured through a contract with the federal government. So when the federal government builds dams, for example, it will often make deals with the water users about the terms that they can use that water. And that water particularly can be turned on and off pretty much. There are a lot of Endangered Species Act cases across the country where, especially in the West, where the contracts say there's some provision that the federal government could curtail that use, and when it does, there's not a lot of recourse. There are other instances where the courts are mixed. There have been water rights that have been disrupted by the Endangered Species Act, and when they have been disrupted, compensation has been provided, and there have been cases where it hasn't been provided. And I don't think that we have firm law about what will happen in our state about that. And that's going to be a question of not just Utah judges, but it's going to be something that's going to be resolved by most likely the 10th Circuit Court of Appeal, which is basically a court that oversees the Western United States, except for sort of the coastal region. But I think that there is a possibility that ends up happening. The one thing that is sort of an unpleasant thought about this, though, is the way that the shares are disrupted is going to follow Utah water law, and the oldest water I mean, the water that has been used the longest is the water user that's been using it the longest has the highest priority. That tends to be a lot of agricultural users, and the newer users tend to be cities and industry. And so it kind of, in a lot of ways, we do need a reallocation of water that's desperately needed. We need more conservation for sure in all our sectors, but there needs to be a reallocation of water that hopefully, in my view, the best way to do it is to find willing buyers and sellers. But if the Endangered Species Act kind of forces that, the state nor the federal government really will not pick who the winners or loser is. I would think that looking at precedent, we're going to look at what water law would tell us is just look to see who the most senior user is, and that would be the person that would be most at risk. Is the most junior water users are going to be the ones that have the weakest rights.
Thank you. This question looks to be directed at Beth Parker, and it says, what does the state need to do if it wants to show the federal government that it has a viable plan to save the Phalarope without federal intervention? And Beth, I think you're muted if you're speaking.
Sorry about that.
Oh, you're all good.
So Brig and I were actually talking about this earlier today after we had met with our Great Salt Lake Policy Accelerator class. We teach a Great Salt Lake Policy Accelerator class at the University of Utah. And it's important to note that while we have light years to go on saving the lake and saving the Phalarope, we have come light years so far. So if we look back to where we were in, say, 2015, there have been substantial changes. And I think I'll just go over those a little bit to show that change can happen, and then talk about what needs to be done. Unfortunately, I don't have a magic hat or crystal ball that can come up with one solution that, you know, can save the lake and preserve the lake. If we did, we wouldn't all be here, right? If there was just one thing we needed to do. There are lots of steps that need to be taken, that have been taken, that need to continue to be taken with lots of different entities and stakeholders. So notwithstanding the challenges that the lake faces, Utah has taken some meaningful steps. So over the past couple of years, Utah has dedicated almost $1 billion toward initiatives, water conservation initiatives, and initiatives focused on conserving and getting more water to the lake. Among these is a $40 million Great Salt Lake Water Enhancement Trust, and this trust is meant to get more water to the lake, pay people to essentially lease water, not necessarily sell it. They want to, they can sell it, but lease water so they still own the water for the purposes of getting that water to the lake, and some other things as well. But that is a wonderful step. The state has also, and this is pretty radical, has undertaken some efforts to transform Utah's water law. And water law is a slow-moving area of law. I mean, it's been stagnant for over 100 years, and Utah has made modifications to redefine beneficial use, which is sort of use it or lose it. That's how the water in the West has been for a long time. But it provides exemptions to this use it or lose it requirements that allow for conservation transfers. Hey, I'm going to conserve this water and I'll apply for a change for conservation purposes. And Utah made some changes for in-stream flow laws dealing with conservation. And all of this helps get that conserved or saved water. We now have to get it to the lake. But the state has also made prioritized appropriations and money, set aside money for agricultural water optimization to see how to grow more crops with less drops. And one thing that we at the law school think is most significant is last year, lawmakers established the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Office with the Commissioner Brian Steed and Deputy Commissioner Tim Davis, who are here today. And they're sort of the ringleaders here. And the commissioner's office has made and taken enormous steps in the last year. I don't even know if you can say year, Tim, 6-9 months, really. It just, the pace at which they've worked has been pretty breakneck speed. So their responsibilities include not only creating, but upholding a strategic plan, and they release their strategic plan. If viewers on here have not read that plan, I would encourage you to read it. It was released January 15th, right before the session. So some of the media probably overtook that. But their responsibilities include creating and upholding the strategic plan and facilitating and coordinating efforts. So those are some of the things that the state has done more, but those are some things that the state has done. Now, what else can the state do? We still have a long ways to go. One thing we really need to do in Utah is figure out shepherding, or as the state engineer likes to call it, is it distributing? Is that what she's calling it now, Tim? So what that is, ensuring that these water rights that are saved water, conserved water, that are intended for Great Salt Lake actually get to Great Salt Lake and aren't used by, say, a junior user. And these in-stream flow rights have to be treated with equal dignity as other appropriated rights, and protected from diversion by intervening water users. And this is really important and something that the state is working on, but we do have to figure out better shepherding. We've made great steps toward water conservation, but we need more. Even if you look at municipalities, there are 77 municipalities in the Great Salt Lake Basin that don't have any water conservation ordinances. So there are things that need to be done. Something that has just been done, but I personally would have liked to see it funded at a higher level. It was not fully funded, but there's something called split season leasing, where farmers can grow crops for part of the season and then decide maybe on their third crop, say alfalfa, their third cutting, they can lease that water for the last part of the growing season to the lake. There was some money set aside for a study for that, and that could secure more water for the lake. So other things, quantification. So quantifying the amount of water saved through existing conservation and committing that to the lake, because if we save our water, but we don't know how much water we saved, we don't know how much water is getting to the lake. Making the water bank go from a theory to reality. Brig talked a little bit about the lake. Budgetary, appropriating more money to the commissioner's office. So the commissioner's office can do even more. And using that Great Salt Lake Enhancement Trust and using more of that money, and increase collaboration and coordination among all stakeholders, whether it's state agencies, state and local governments, and even federal governments and private entities. And I do know the commissioner's office is doing that. Tim was kind enough to come to our law class last week and was telling us that the commissioner's office meets weekly with state agencies, monthly with stakeholders. So they really are improving this coordination. So we're not flying in different directions, but we're all on the same path. So I think if we do all of these things, we can realize that the lake has impacts that do reach beyond those affecting just the Phalarope, but we have to decide what we're going to do right now with this opportunity before us. And if we take the steps to save the Phalarope, we'll also be taking steps to save the lake. And sorry, that was a really long answer.
That was wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, please, Patrick.
Yeah, if I could just add something, because I really appreciate hearing that rundown of everything the state's doing. And, our petition was not meant to denigrate those efforts. The petition simply saying, here's what the modeling says about the trajectory of the lake. However, I think something that really struck me during the process of putting together the petition is, it's not just Wilson's Phalarope. There's 10 million birds that stop at Great Salt Lake. And those birds distribute all over the Western United States and really all over the hemisphere. And so what happens at Great Salt Lake doesn't stay in Utah. It's actually of interest to everybody in the hemisphere. And certainly everybody in the country. And, 1/3 of the water in the watershed, as I understand it, is used in Idaho and Wyoming. And so, that's like a lot of water. And so, outside of the context of specifically the Endangered Species Act, I do think there's a federal role here, because in some ways it's unfair for the entire burden of saving Great Salt Lake to fall on Utah taxpayers. Like a third of the water is used outside of Utah, and the consequences of a healthy or not healthy Great Salt Lake are felt all across the country. And so, I do think that one thing the Phalarope petition kind of highlights is that everybody has a stake here. Everybody in the country has a stake. And so, I think we do need to be thinking broadly about how the government's assets and the government's resources, the federal government's assets and resources, could be deployed to help save Great Salt Lake. Again, so that the burden doesn't entirely fall on the state of Utah, when there are a variety of stakeholders outside of the state who are affected by this and who contribute to the issues at hand.
Thank you, Patrick. For Tim Davis, a member of the community said, I had seen an article that quoted Brian Steed saying he does not believe that listing the Phalarope is necessary. And is that true? And if so, I'd love to hear reasoning or just your personal thoughts.
I saw that you sent that question ahead of time, Kate. I don't know if Brian said that, and I don't know where the article, if it was quoted, what the quote was. But I think Beth did a great job of talking about all the things we're already doing, and I think more importantly and probably if Brian did say that, what he was pointing at was, the state of Utah's already committed to saving the lake, and we're taking significant steps. And I won't go back through Beth's great list, but we're already fully committed. It's too important to our communities, the economy, to the environment, to the species that rely upon it. And I have overseen the water right laws for a state before. Both Brig and Beth were right. The amount of change that has happened in just an incredibly short amount of time to fairly Byzantine, 100-year-old water laws, it is startling. And the Great Salt Lake Strategic Plan that Beth mentioned, that the Commissioner's Office developed and was approved by the governor, but at the end of 2023, that really lays out a 30-year process, both with short-term, medium-term, and long-term actions that we as a state will take and will continue to evolve to make sure that we get the lake to a healthy range and are able to sustain it. And then that will have a benefit for species like the Wilson's Phalarope, as well as all of us that depend upon the lake. And so I'm excited about where we're going. We were going there before, and I don't think the petition, if that quote was right, we didn't need the petition to drive us to make those changes. We were already committed to doing it.
Thank you so much for your thoughts. I've loved hearing about all the things that the state is doing for the lake. The question for Patrick, or Beth, do you have something to say? Is that?
I was just going to add one quick thing in. So the state has done a lot. And I went through that list, but one project my law students are doing right now is coming up with a list of what can the state do. And Tim has seen this list. It was originally 175 proposed solutions. Some of these were small. We've condensed it and synthesized it down to 114, but we've come up with 114 things the state could do. So we have come a long way. The state has done a lot. We still have a long way to go.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. For Patrick, how does this petition compare to other petitions that you've been involved in within other places? And could you touch on, or I guess you've already touched on that, but yeah, how does this petition compare to others?
This is, as far as my experience, this is far and away the most rigorous petition I've ever been involved in. Most of my work focuses on narrow endemic species that have a very limited range, and so they're endangered just mostly because of that limited range. And so, this is a fairly unique petition in terms of the species has been observed in all 50 states. And there are like about 1 million of these birds. That is why our petition is for a threatened status, not an endangered status. Technically, endangered means in danger of extinction. Threatened means threatened with becoming endangered. And so those are two different categories of species on the Endangered Species Act list. This petition is for threatened because we're not saying Wilson's phalarope is going to disappear tomorrow. But if the Great Salt Lake crashes and the salinity becomes too high for the inverts, then it will be an endangered species at that point. And so that's why we petition for a threatened listing. I think, like I said, it's a very, it's sort of a master's thesis on Wilson's phalarope and hydrology. So it's a very rigorous petition. But that's what's required for a landscape scale species like this, that so many habitats are affected. There's so many threats. It's not just Great Salt Lake. I encourage folks to read the petition if you haven't. There's lithium mining in South America. Lake Abert in Oregon has gone completely dry. Climate change is going to affect this species in more places than Great Salt Lake. There are a lot of threats to Wilson's phalarope. And just to tie it back to a question we had earlier, which is, well, what's the success rate here? I actually don't have like percentages on successful petitions, but I will say that our success rate on petitions for narrow endemic species with a very small range, is quite high, because those species are very threatened with extinction, and generally there's one or two key causes that need to be addressed to prevent that extinction. And so they end up getting listed quite frequently. Landscape scale species across many states, aren't listed as often. And I think a good example that we're looking at right now that's kind of corollary to Wilson's phalarope is the monarch butterfly. The monarch butterfly was in candidate status for many years. And so, I think that is a more likely kind of outcome for a widely ranging species like this. And so, yeah, the track record of getting, national scale species listed recently is less good. Some of the old school petitions and listings, like the bald eagle, for instance, is a national scale species that was listed. It was then removed after it recovered. So, I think Brig laid it out earlier about a possible scenario, and I do think it's a fairly high likelihood. We're going to be pushing for this species to be listed, but ultimately our concern is not, is this species on a list? Our concern is there 1 million new acre feet of water getting into that lake every year? And that will ultimately save the species. And so, regardless of by hook or crook, I think everybody shares the goal of restoring Great Salt Lake to health.
Thank you, Patrick. Question for the panel: what can the public do to make sure that this petition has the best chance of succeeding, or in general, what can the public do to follow along or give input on this petition?
Part of the petition process there will be some opportunity for public comment. But the way I kind of think about an endangered species petition is, it's basically, particularly when you've got a species like this, where you've got a keystone ecosystem and kind of a central player here that is kind of standing in for a lot of other species, and in a lot of other interests, including our air quality and other things. It's sort of the canary in the coal mine. And I think that the way that this is going to be, decided is not a popularity contest, but it's going to be a rigorous scientific review. And so, I think that it's kind of unfortunate hearing it in this way, that the kinds of public input that would really matter would be the kinds of things that would help the Fish and Wildlife Service understand what the best science is on the species, right? And that's going to be a pretty high bar for the average person. I think that the more meaningful thing is, try to figure out ways to get involved in saving the lake. And there are a lot of ways to do that. And that really, whether or not the species is listed, put it this way, in some ways you can think that the petition failed if we get a candidate species and then ultimately the candidate is no longer of concern. but that's exactly what everybody wants. Because what that means is the bird is no longer endangered, which means the lake is no longer in peril, right? And so what we really need to be focusing on is how can we get involved in saving Great Salt Lake? I think there are a lot of good organizations that you can follow. I think Grow the Flow is top shelf for me locally, but there are a lot of others that are doing work, and certainly there's a lot of good information on the commissioner's website, and also at the Great Salt Lake Project at the University of Utah. We try to keep people apprised about what's going on as well. So those are some resources. And I'll put the website links to the 3 organizations I mentioned. Great. Ben just did Grow the Flow. I'll put up the commissioner's website, and I'll put up a link to the Great Salt Lake Project at the University of Utah as well, if folks are interested in getting our newsletters and other things.
I think one other.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I just really quickly, I think one other thing that people can do, in addition to what Brig mentioned, is contact their lawmakers, their state lawmakers, and let them know that they're concerned about Great Salt Lake. They're concerned about species at Great Salt Lake, like Wilson's Phalarope, but they're also concerned about their overall health and the state of this place we call home. And if lawmakers are hearing that, then it will keep it top of mind.
Yeah, I want to reinforce with, I think the question is not, I think the way Brig was landing was the way I would if I can, Kate, I'd restate the question. What can people do for the lake? And I think that that's the key question. And so we have, and I really think that even without the listing, without a petition or without a listing, we need to come together voluntarily to take the steps to conserve enough water, make sure that conserved water is dedicated to the lake, and then it gets to the lake, and we can measure the impact on the lake, and that the lake is able to achieve the healthy range that we've identified and sustain at that range. And if that's done, then put this back on Patrick, then there's no need for a listing, right? So, but I think that's the key question, is just what can we all do for the lake? And I think those are if I was going to say those 3 simple things: conserve, dedicate, and deliver enough water to the lake. And we're working on that now in a voluntary fashion. Without having a federal listing, we have the opportunity to maintain, to continue to work in a voluntary fashion to get enough water to the lake. And I think that's what everybody should be doing.
Yeah, and I basically want to agree with the other 3 panelists. You know, a failed petition would be the lake crashing and Wilson's Phalarope going extinct. That's failure. Success would be Wilson's Phalarope is not in danger of extinction because the lake was saved. And so, you know, I want to agree with that. You know, we are here doing our thing that we do all across the country, protecting species and providing a legal backstop for conservation. But ultimately, you know, we all want the same thing, and that's a healthy Great Salt Lake and our wildlife not in danger of extinction. And so, you know, I think it's a challenge to all of us to make that happen. And right, I think ultimately it's about how do you support the efforts to save the lake.
Thank you for all those wonderful responses. And thank you all for coming here today, this panel. We're coming short here on time, and I want to respect the time of our wonderful panelists here. And so in closing and wrapping up, if anyone has any final thoughts that they would like to share before we are done, I would love to hear anything.
I would just say, to kind of just double down on what everybody has just said, to safeguard our way of life here in Utah and this place we love and call home. It's vital that we take active steps to protect the lake, and continued steps that we don't start to forget about the lake and think we've had 2 great years and think that our work is done. But this effort is crucial not only for the well-being of species like the Wilson's Phalarope, but for our community's future as well.
I can't top that. So I just wanted to, Kate, you and Ben and everybody who showed up. I thank you for your interest in the lake. Thank you for taking steps to help us save the lake. And that if you ever have any ideas about how we can other steps we can take, let us know.
I'd just like to say I'm not from Utah. I live in Death Valley, but I've gotten to spend a lot of time around Great Salt Lake lately and getting to interact with this incredible community that is fighting to save it. You know, all of you on this call and many others, and it's very inspiring to me. I work on a lot of intractable issues, and I don't think this is an intractable issue. I think it's a winnable issue. I think we can save the lake. And, you know, being around you all has really helped instill that in me quite a bit. So thank you all for your dedication.
I'd love that note of hope at the end that Patrick gave it. I have to agree. You know, but it's going to take all of us, and we can't let up. I also just wanted to thank you, Kate, for doing such a great job tonight. Hats off to you.
Thanks so much. I appreciate that. And thank you again to our wonderful panelists and for everybody showing up tonight. I want to echo the thoughts of Ben in the comments. Thanks for submitting questions and for being willing to be here and think about ways that we can help the lake. It does take all of us. I love that thought. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your evening. We're going to wrap up here. And again, thank you all so much for coming. And we look forward to seeing you at future panels, future events like this. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night.